Gemaras.
Okay.
So we'll have to just get our way through it. So if I'm not mistaken, yesterday we ended off just on the top of Samach Zayin Amar Aleph. And I just want to quickly review the cases. What we were discussing were the three cases that Shmuel commented on, the way it was understood. I'll go back to the own base. The way that it was understood by Abaye. Right, so Abaye said, "How the Amar Shmuel ein bitl rishus mechaskel chater yaminel b'shtei chateres u'pesach echad b'neim." I'm sorry, Rava. Abaye said that Abaye understood Shmuel the way our Gemara had understood it up until that point. That there's two chatzeres that Shmuel said you cannot make an eruv. That's only if there's two independent chatzeres with independent accesses to the mavoi. That's the type of chater where Shmuel said that you cannot be mevatel on Shabbos. But if you have one chater going through another chater, there you could be mevatel on Shabbos. That was our understanding of Shmuel. Let me see if I could just go back a couple of pages to look at the distinction using the pictures, so it makes it a little easier. But when there are two chatzeres that have independent access to the mavoi, and they don't have to join because they can remain separate, their bittul would not be possible. But if you have one chater that goes to another chater, so that was like the configuration of Kodesh and Kodesh HaKadoshim, over there you could make bittul on Shabbos, and the reason why is because if they didn't make an eruv, then the residents of the outer chater are going to ruin it for the residents of the inner chater because they actually have rights in there. They have rights to walk through the outer chater to get through to the outside. That's how the Gemara ended up with Abaye. Rava said that even if you have an inner chater and an outer chater, bittul does not always work. And we ran through the four cases, depending on whether or not the eruv was placed in the inner chater or in the outer chater. And we said that if the eruv is placed in the outer chater, then no bittul would work at all. And if one of the residents of the inner chater or the outer chater did not become part of the eruv, it would mess it up for everybody, and there's no solution. The only case where there would be a solution is if the eruv was placed in the inner chater. If the eruv was placed in the inner chater, and the person that forgot to join the eruv was a member of the outer chater, so then the inner chater can achta dosha, they can close off and sever from the outer chater, and then the eruv is physically in their space, so they have an eruv for their space, and they can say that we want to exclude you because by including you, it's going to mess us up because one of your members did not join the eruv. So therefore, we'll just shut the door and we'll sever ourselves from you, and we'd be allowed to carry inside. And the last thing that the Gemara said all the way to end was, in the case where the eruv was placed at the outer chater, and one of the members of the inner chater was the person that forgot to join the eruv, the Gemara has a question: why should that be a problem? Again, the eruv was placed in the outer chater. The person that forgot to join the eruv was a member of the inner chater. So why don't we just suggest that that member of the inner chater, who was not part of the eruv, let him relinquish his rights that he has in the inner chater, and once he's mevatel his rights, then the people of the outer chater are only dealing with the other members of the inner chater, and those other members have a proper eruv, and therefore v'tishru b'adayu, and everything should be mutter. So on that, and this is what Rav Huna asked Rava, and that Rava responded that would only work if, whenever there's someone who forgot to make an eruv, if he only has to relinquish his rights to one member, and it's good enough for everybody else. That would work, because by this member of the inner chater relinquishing his rights to the other members of the inner chater, he's only relinquishing his rights to the members of the inner chater, not to those in the outer chutzner. And if that's enough, you're right. That might work over here. But what the Rabbi was saying is that I'm going according to the Shita that if there's one person in the chutzner who did not join the Eruv, in order for all the others to be allowed to carry there that Shabbos, he would have to specifically be mevatel whatever rights he has in the chutzner to each individual member. And therefore, he could be mevatel his rights to the inner chutzner to each individual member, but he cannot be mevatel his rights in the outer chutzner to each individual member because of Shmuel's halacha that ein mevatlin mechutzer lechutzer. Now, I want to point out something very important because Shlomi Feintuch asked yesterday, what is the reasoning, what's the logic behind this halacha of Shmuel that I can only relinquish the rights that I have in my chutzner, I cannot relinquish rights that I have in a different chutzner. For instance, if I have Drisas Regel, I can walk through it. Why does Shmuel say that I cannot relinquish my rights? Whatever rights I have, why can I not relinquish them? That's the question that Shlomi Feintuch asked yesterday. And I told him that hopefully, as we get through the day, it would become clear the answer. And in fact, the Rashi is very explicit in explaining what the reason is. And Rashi says, from a Choshen Mishpat standpoint, of course, I could relinquish my rights. The same way I could relinquish my rights in my chutzner, I could relinquish any interests I have in a neighboring chutzner. But the question here is, did the Rabbanan allow you to carry with such a maneuver? So Rashi says here, going back to the case of the Chorva, where we had three houses in the chutzner, A, B, and C, and B was a Chorva, so and no one lives there, so that's common space, just like A and B, just like A and C, the residents of A, the residents of C, share all of the chutzner, they're also sharing the space in the Chorva. Now, regarding the rest of the chutzner, we know bittul works. If they didn't make an eruv before Shabbos, the resident of A or the resident of C could relinquish their rights to the chutzner, and then the other resident would be allowed to carry there. But it doesn't work for the Chorva, which is puzzling. Why shouldn't it work for the Chorva? The Chorva is in the same chutzner that we're talking about. So if I'm relinquishing my rights to the chutzner, why can't I also relinquish my rights to that Chorva, which is just another area in the chutzner? So on that, Rashi tells us the L'Shor Rabbanan, the logic of Shmuel, is the L'Shor Rabbanan. This is Samach Vav Amid Beis towards the top. The L'Shor Rabbanan, the Bittul Rishus, Ela B'Chotzer Shalafnei Abayis. The Rabbanan only allowed Bittul Rishus for the Chotzer that's in front of your house. Why? Dakilu Bar Rabbanan Dave'ikr Tash Mishayu also. They only allowed this Bittul by an area that you really use. In those days, people kept their stuff. They didn't have big houses, so they kept their stuff in the chutzner. So that was a vital part of their functioning. They needed to access that. They needed to be able to take kalim in and out of the chutzner to survive. The chorva is extra space. That's not vital to their survival. And this whole heter that the Rabbanan say that if you didn't make an eruv, you could be mevatel your rishos, they only allow that l'gabe your immediate space that you actually use and need on a regular basis. But the chorva, which is a bonus space, that they will not be makel for. And that's the reasoning why you cannot be mevatel your rights in a different chutzner. Because again, we're only allowing a heter here for space that I'm actually using and that I rely on.
So Yosy, so according to Rashi, in our case it was Kaddish, and they needed access to the Mavli. So he's saying it's not vital for them to be able to get out?
But they don't need to put their kalim there. They need to walk there. But since they don't need to put their
so
kalim
needing
there,
to walk there is not considered vital, according to Rashi.
That's right. That's right. That's how Rashi is explaining. Now, I want Daniel Finkel was kind enough. We have been learning the last couple of days that if there's a goy in your chutzner, you cannot have him be mevatel as a shus. You cannot include him in the eruv because the Rebbeinu wanted to discourage us living with goy. However, you could rent the space, and that would be the only solution. So there's actually a rental agreement that was drawn up between our eruv, the Jewish community of Toronto, and the city of Toronto. And we actually have a copy of it, and Daniel Finkel gave it to me. So I just want to read it here. City of Toronto, Toronto Eruv Corporation. This is to confirm that we've amended the second codicil of the Toronto Air Corporation Proclamation signed by Alan Tonks in his capacity as chairman of the Metropolitan Toronto Council to read as follows. An Eruv district has been created in the city of Toronto that will be increased from time to time. And the office of the mayor of the city of Toronto has been requested by the Toronto Eruv Corporation on behalf of those who reside within the Eruv district to grant the right within the aforesaid area solely for the purpose of carrying on the Sabbath and other Jewish holidays. And the office of the mayor of the city of Toronto deems it to be in the public interest that those of its residents for whom the request has been presented be granted the rights requested, and likewise deems it to be of no detriment to the rights and general welfare of other members of the public. I, Mayor Rob Ford, on behalf of Toronto City Council, I'm pleased to declare a grant of the rights requested by the President of the Toronto Eruv Corporation in order to define the Sabbath boundaries in accordance with the Jewish law. And here we have Rob Ford's autograph over the shoulder.
I'd love to know how they explained an Eruv to him. You're not allowed to carry on Shabbos, but if you put a string, a little string around an area, it's okay.
It's very simple. They told him, Rob, we're going to contribute to your re-election campaign with strings attached.
Oh!
What a gewaltige letter.
Okay. Zog the hele Gemara. Rab
I hope they
Chisda.
didn't have to explain a kapar slug.
Okay, yeah, that would be a fun
Yeah.
description. Okay, Zog the hele Gemara. Rab Chisda v'Rab Sheshes. Rab Chisda and Rab Sheshes were two Torah giants. Kipagu b'hadei adadi, whenever they would meet each other, Rab Chisda marson sefevosei mimes naised Rab Sheshes. Rab Chisda his lips would tremble from fear of the tremendous clarity and knowledge that Rab Sheshes had on all the Mishnayos. And Rashi speaks out. Why was he afraid? The Yorei Rab Chisda shaloyik shaloi mi Mishnah al Mishnah the Yomer loy l'tartzim. Rab Sheshes was always afraid that Rab Chisda would ask him a stira in Mishnayos and then ask Rab Chisda to provide an answer. He was terrified of that occurring, and that's why his lips would tremble when he met Rab Chisda. On the other hand, that's why Rab Chisda would tremble when he met Rab Sheshes. And Rab Sheshes was just as afraid of Rab Chisda. Rab Sheshes marsa kula gufei mipil pulei Rab Chisda. Rab Chisda was a giant because he was unbelievably lamdan, chorif v'sover haya b'yoser. He understood things with a depth, v'omuk b'sheiloser. And therefore, since Rab Chisda, so Rab Sheshes was the one who had a big bikiyas, and Rab Chisda was the one who had tremendous analytical abilities, and therefore Marsa Kula Gufa, his whole body would tremble before Rab Chisda. Now, I'm just trying, maybe someone can help me understand. Rab Chisda was afraid of Rab Shesh's knowledge, and that Rab Sheshes would ask him kashas, steers on Mishnayos. But it wasn't enough to make his whole body tremble, it was only enough to make his lips tremble. Yet on the other hand, the Lamdin, Rab Chisda was the Lamdin, Rab Sheshes was so afraid of him that his whole body trembled. So I'm not sure what the reason is. Like when you're talking to a brisker, your whole body trembles. When you're talking to a guy from the mirror, only your lips tremble. I'm not sure if someone can shed some light on the difference. I would be very interested to hear. Boy mine Rab Chisda mer Rab Sheshes. Rab Chisda asked the following shaila of Rab Sheshes: Shnei batim, if you had two homes, mishnei tzidei Rishus HaRabim, on either side of a Rishus HaRabim. So this is similar to the famous case we had with Rabbi Yehuda, where one person owns a home on one side of the street, and another person owns a home on the opposite side of the street. Rabbi Yehuda said that you could put a lechi or a koyer on one end, a lechi koyer on the other end, and that'll create the space on the street in between the two homes as a virtual Rishus HaYachid, and therefore they can carry there. And the Chachamim said, this is not how you make an Erev in a Rishus HaRabban. That's a case we had several times. This case is not that same case as that, but it's also two houses on two different sides of the street. So you have two houses on two sides of the streets, and then Uvo Nochrim, and this might belong to the same person. Uvo Nochrim v'hikifon mechitza b'Shabbos, and Goyim came on Shabbos and built a wall. Imagine you live on one side of Bathurst Street, and your friend owns a house directly across the street, and Goyim came and put up a big stone wall across the street to block the street up in between your two homes. And now you have your private lawn. And the article has a simple picture of it that makes it very easy. 67A1 at the bottom. You have two houses on opposite sides of the street, and you have a hard wall. So now they have a yard. These cars are trying to get through, so there's probably noise, people are honking. But at the end of the day, now they've created a chutzner. The problem is these two people never made an Erev Chetzeres. They couldn't have, because before Shabbos, which would have been the appropriate time to make an Erev Chetzeres, there was nothing to make an Erev Chetzeres on, because this was a Rishus HaRabban. On Shabbos, the situation changed. Now we have a Rishus HaYachid here, and they did not make an Erev Chetzeres. So the question is, how do you deal with this instance? So, Dr. Gemara, Shnei Batim, Mishnei Tzidei Rishus HaRabban, Uvo Nochem v'Kifon Mechitza b'Shabbos. And the Goyim came and were kind enough to block off the street, so now they have a private area in between their two homes. Now, what would Allah be? The question is, can one of the residents, they can't make an Erev, it's too late, it's on Shabbos, but could one of these two people be mevatel his rights to the other person, and at least the other person can now carry in the chutzner? So aliba demand Amar ein bittul rishus mechatzer lechatzer. If you hold that, like Shmuel, that you cannot be mevatel rishus from one chutzner to another chutzner, loisi boila. Surely here you can't. Zot Gemara, but
sorry, Yosy, I don't understand. I thought it's Rishus HaRabban in between. So how is he being mevatel?
well, once they put the wall up, it's no longer a Rishus HaRabban. It now becomes a Rishus HaYachid.
Yeah, but it's not.
It has
part of
nothing
their
to do with
property.
ownership. It has nothing to do with ownership of the property.
Right.
The definition of Rishus HaRabban and Rishus HaYachid, the Gabi Hilchos carrying, has nothing to do with ownership. You can technically make a wall in the middle of the 401, and now you're allowed to carry there,
Right.
even though technically it's not your property. So if you hold Ein Bittul Rishus Mechatz L'Chav Lo Tiboilach, then for sure this is not a shayla. Hashta, the Iboyi Laruve Me'esmal Motzum Arvi, in a regular case, when you have two chatzeres that are side by side, and they each have their own access to Rishus HaRabban, so they had the option before Shabbos to join and make an Erev, and they didn't. But they could have. Nevertheless, if they didn't, Amrit Shmuel said, Ein Bittul Rishus Mechatz L'Chatzer. On Shabbos, they can't be mevatel their Rishus to one another so that at least one side can carry. Hach, which is even worse, the Iboy Laruva Me'esma Loy Motzum Arvi. In our case, they didn't even have the option to make the Erev before Shabbos, because before Shabbos there were no walls there. Like Kolshkin, surely we can't rectify this issue by making bittul on Shabbos. So Kisiboylach, it's very interesting because this what Reb Chisda asked this question to Reb Sheshes, meaning Reb Sheshes, Reb Chisda, who's a Lamdan, was asking Reb Sheshes for his bekiyas to be able to find some source to answer this question. And or maybe I'm right. I'm not sure who's saying Kisi Boilach. If it's Reb Chisda, the Lamdan, explaining the nuances of a shaila, then maybe this makes sense. So Kisi Boilach, what is your question? Aliba demand Omar, yesh bitl rishus mechatzer l'chatzer. When you have two chatzeres side by side, even if you didn't make an error before Shabbos, you could join one. The residents of Chatzer A could be mevatel their rights to the residents of Chatzer B, and therefore at least the residents of Chatzer B will be able to carry. Hosam, the boy laruva me'esmo motzum arvi, since they had the option of making an erev before Shabbos, so this was eruvable property. Therefore, betula nami motzim. Therefore, on Shabbos, if they didn't make an eruv, we'll let them join forces using bittul. This wasn't even eruv material before Shabbos. Therefore, betula nami motzim. Therefore, they cannot make bittul on Shabbos. Or maybe it doesn't make a difference. Before Shabbos I couldn't. Now I could. Now I can make bittul. So that was the shaila that Reb Chisda the Lamdan posed to Reb Sheshes the Baki. Omolei, Reb Sheshes answered, Ein mevatlim, period. They would not be able to be mevatl. So therefore, since they couldn't have made an eruv before Shabbos, they won't be able to make bittul on Shabbos, and they'll have to wait until next Shabbos to make an eruv, and then they'll be able to carry out in that chutz. That was question number one. What about another question? Mes Nochri b'Shabbos. So let's set up this case. Zot Rashi, Mes Nochri b'Shabbos, Ha Nami Boy Minei. This is the next question that Reb Chisda asked of Reb Sheshes. Shnei Yisraelim. There's two Yisraelim who live in a chutzner. V'Nochri and a goy, Hadar b'chutzner. So right now we know that even if the two make an eruv, they first have to rent the goy's rights in the chutzner. But v'loy sachur, they did not rent the space from the goy. And v'lo yirbu, they didn't make an eruv. They didn't deal with it. And on Shabbos, umes nochi b'Shabbos. So now the nochi is out of the picture. So now, can we join forces? Ma levatel zalazeh. Could one of the two Jewish residents be mevatel his rights in the chosser, so that at least the other resident could carry? So let's see what the shayla is. Mes nochi b'Shabbos. Mal aliba demand Omar soichrin. If you remember, we had a story yesterday where Rabbi Yochanan had to make a psak. Just on this case, a couple of people showed up in the pundik, and there was there were yidden there, and the goy wasn't there. And on Shabbos, the goy showed up, and there was a shaila if they could rent the goy space on Shabbos. And Rabbi Yochanan said, "No problem, you could." So Alibu demand the Amar Soichman loyti boilach. According to the man the Amar Rabbi Yochanan, who said that on Shabbos you could rent space from the goy, there it's not a shaila. Hashta tarti avdina. If you could do both bittul and schiris on Shabbos, chadam aboy. So let's look at the case closely. The case of Rabbi Yochanan is that there was a couple of yidden that assembled in the pundak. There was no goy there at the time, so they made an eruv. On Shabbos, the goy shows up. He ruined their eruv, so they have to rent his space. Rashi speaks out over there that they can't just rent his space and then go back to their eruv. Once the goy came, he's destroyed their eruv. So even if they rent space from the goy on Shabbos, that wouldn't solve their problem. They then have to do a bittul, which means one of the people would have to be mevatel his rishus to the other one. If there's two people, if there's three people, two would have to be mevatel, but they would have to be mevatel rishus to just one person, and then that one person would still be able to carry there. So hashta tarti avdina. If you're allowed to do it in that case, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he said rent the space of the goy and then make bittul, so that one of you at least can continue carrying in that chotzer throughout Shabbos. Chadam aboy. In this case, we don't need to make a schiris because the goy is dead. All we need to do is make bittul. So maybe this would surely not be a problem. Now, if you remember, Rabbi Lazar was struggling over Rabbi Yochanan's psak, and Rabbi Zera couldn't figure out what he was struggling about. And I'm not sure who it was. And then we had someone else told him, "I don't understand. You should be able to read his mind. If you're a Talmudic scholar, you should know why Rabbi Eliezer doesn't understand what Rabbi Yochanan said, because you should have known that Shmuel said Ein Tzorchen, that Shmuel paskined that you could not rent from a goy on Shabbos." So Alibu Devan Ein Tzorchen. What is Shmuel saying? Tarti Hudalayadina. The reason why he said Ein Tzorchen from a goy on Shabbos, because that wouldn't have been enough. You'd have to rent it, and then you'd have to be mevatel your shus, so at least one person in the chutz can carry. Hachad avdinan, but in our case, you only need to do one thing. You only need to make bittul. You don't have to rent from the goy. The goy died. Or it doesn't make a difference. Amar later, Rav Sheshes answered, Ani Aimer Mevatl. I hold you to be allowed to do it. The Hamnuna Amar Ein Mevatl. But Hamnuna, and remember, Rav Sheshes says, I can call him Hamnuna. You better call him Rav Hamnuna. Where Hamnuna Amar Ein Mevatl, you would not be able to be Mevatl Rishus. So again, the two shilas. I'm sorry?
No, go ahead.
So the two shilas that were discussed were, shilah number one was if before Shabbos there were two people that could not have made an Erev Chetzeres because there was a big thoroughfare in between their two homes, and on Shabbos the reality changed, and now they're technically a Rishus HaYachid, and now you have the rabbinic requirement of making an Erev Chetzeres. There was a question, could you make an Erev Chetzeres in a place where before Shabbos you could not have made an Erev Chetzeres because it wasn't even a Rishus HaYachid before Shabbos? And to that, Rav Sheshes answered, you cannot. And the second question that was asked was if there was a goy amongst two Yidden, and because of that they couldn't make an Erev, and on Shabbos the goy died, could we now make bittul? And on that, Rav Sheshes said there's a machlokes between Rav Sheshes, who holds it works, and you could make bittul, and Rav Hamnuna, who holds it doesn't.
Yosy,
Yes.
just a sidebar question. With Bittel, with two Yidden, can they put a time limit on it and split Shabbos up? So that one does it on half a Shabbos and the other does it on the other half a Shabbos, so they can both access it on Shabbos?
I wonder. Because we know that the bittul is revocable. If I'm a battle marishus and then I go out and use the chutzner, it messes it up for the other guy. So it seems like it is fluid.
Okay.
It seems like it is fluid. I don't have a raya, but I do know that my bittul is revocable. So if my bittul is revocable, why can't, after I revoke my bittul, you turn around and be mevatel your part? So from logic, it seems like it would work. From a Chisda's perspective, it would work. From a Pshesh's perspective, he needs facts. He needs to see it in writing. That I don't have a proof. Shlomi, were you here when I pointed out to Rashi before about why Shmuel says Ein mevatel mechotzer lechotzer?
No.
Okay, because you asked me yesterday. Where is that
Right.
coming from? So
And I was looking at the Gemara after the shir yesterday, and Duvi and I spoke about it at Chakwas in the morning, and I said I think that the Gemara answers it. I looked at it and I didn't get it fully.
So it's
That's-
really a Rashi on Samach Vav Amud Beis, which talks about the churva. The case of the churva is also very puzzling because, in fact, you know A and C, right? There's A, B, and C. A is one resident, C is the other resident, and B,
Right.
the house in between, is the churva.
Right.
That's the churva is just part of the rest of the chutzner. So we're actually allowed to make bittul so that one of us could use the chutzner. So why doesn't that bittul also work to relinquish my rights in the churva? The churva is just an area in the same chutzner. So that's highly unusual. It's not even a different chutzner. So Rashi says on Samach Vav Amud Beis, it's not a question of whether I could relinquish my choshen mishpat rights. The question is whether that will work and whether the Rabban will allow you to carry there based on that function. So Rashi says, only in the immediate area in your chutzner that you're going to use. The only time we allow bittul is something that most houses were too small. Most of their stuff was stored in the chutzner. So if they needed to go get a cup or a pot or whatever they needed to use on Shabbos, they have to go to their chutzner. So it would be very, very difficult to function without that space. That's where they allow bittul. But I don't really need to get to a churva, and therefore they didn't allow bittul to work. So technically, the choshen mishpatik function of me relinquishing my rights, there shouldn't be a difference between one chutzner and the next, like you mentioned yesterday. The question here is, are the Rabbanim going to allow you to use this gimmick?
How far they allowed you to do it?
That's right. I shouldn't call it a gimmick. It actually works.
Go ahead.
I was trying to find an answer because it's a real lapse in understanding without it. Zok Tehillah Gemara. Amar B'Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Nachri sheyesh lo Pesach arba al arba pasuch l'pikah. So you have a guy who's in the chutzner with other Yidden. So normally he would mess them up because he can't join the Erev, he can't be mevatel, meaning you'd have to rent from him. But he happened to have had a gateway, an opening of 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim, that goes directly to the outside of the city, to the bikah. Meaning he doesn't have to access the chutzner to get out. He has other ways of getting out. So the halacha is, afilu machnas umoitzi gemalim ukroinish kolei and kula derech movi, even though all day long you see that the access that he's using to his property is not his private access to the pickup. Rather, he uses the main thoroughfare that everybody else uses. Ein oyster al b'nei movi. He will not, his use of that space, of that public place, would not asher the b'nei movi. We consider him removed from that public space. My time up, bepischa de miyachid lei, bahu nichalei. He's more happy, even though he's not, but he's more happy, even though he's actually not physically using it, because we said he's actually using the main thoroughfare, but he's happier to use the back door that he has that goes straight into the bika. He's happier to use that. And Rashi says, why is he happier to use that? It's more open than the mavi, so it's shmaker for him to go out through there. So since that's really the best door for him, even though you see him using the main thoroughfare, but since the best door for him is another door, we'll look at it for the purposes of Eruvin, like he's removed from that common area. Therefore, we can make an Eruv there, and his access is going to be his private access. A karfif is an open area, but it's fenced in. It's not quite as vast as a bikah. Would that also be considered a doorway that we would say the goy prefers rather than using the common area? Zok the Gemara, Amar Reb Nachman bar Ami Mishmei to Ulfana. Reb Nachman bar Ami said in the name of Ulfana, Afilu pesuach lekarfif, even if it's open to a karfif, that's also an area that's beneficial. It's better for the goy to use, and therefore he will not mess up the common area, and an Eruv would be allowed to be made there. Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef Amitavayu, Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef, who both said, Nochri agoy beis hasayim oiser. If the carpet is only a beis hasayim or smaller, that's not vast enough for him to prefer to going out in that direction. But Yosef and beis hasayim, if it's a huge space that's greater than beis hasayim, so it's greater than 5,000 square hours, Einoi oiser, then he wouldn't aser, meaning we would say he prefers to go out to this greater area rather than use the common area. Now, what about a Yisrael? Now, we know the halacha is that a karfif that's exactly beis hasayim, shaloi hukaf ladira, it wasn't surrounded with walls to live in, rather it's being used as a ranch, that's considered a Rishus HaYochid. But if it's greater than the beis hasayim, then it's considered a Rishus HaRabban, and you cannot carry there. So the Yisrael, let's say you had a Yisrael who was in a chotzer with other people, and he did not join the Eruv. So now he's going to mess everybody up. But if he has a private doorway to go out into a karpif, then we'll say the same thing about the Yid, that he doesn't mess up there. He doesn't mess up the rest of the people because he's not going to use the common area. He'll also use his back door. But it depends. If it's beis hasayim eino yosher, if it's only a maximum size of beis hasayim, it won't matter because he can access that space. But yosher beis hasayim, if the space that he's accessing is more than the beis hasayim, then yosher, then the Yisrael is not going to use it because he can't carry there. So the Yisrael, his preference is exactly the opposite of what the preference of a goy would. A goy wants more and more space. He doesn't have to worry about the isurim of carrying. A Jew needs a space that he can access. So if it's a beis hasayim or less, only then would we say that the Yid would want to use that area as his entrance and exit. Boy minei Rava bar Chakloi me Rav Huna. Rava, the son of Chakloi, asked a shaila from Rav Huna. Pesuach lekarpaf mahu. What would be the halacha if it was open to a karpaf? So this is really repeating what we've just learned. Amar, he told him, Hari Amar, we said, beis hasayim oiser, if it's a goy and it's only the size of a beis hasayim or smaller, not such a vast area, the goy would not prefer that, and he's using the common area, and therefore there's a problem with your area. But Yosef beis hasayim, if the karpaf that the goy can go out directly to from his property is a greater space as Yosef beis hasayim, then eino Yosef. Amar Ula Amar Bechem. Karpaf Yosef beis hasayim shaloi hukaf ladir. This is a famous halacha. If you have a karpaf, means it's a fenced-in area, but it's bigger than 5,000 square amas. It's not fenced in because someone's living there. It's fenced in because it's a ranch, it's a corral, it's just your property. The afilu kur of afilu kurai, even if it's much, much more than that. So you have a huge area that's that's loy hukaf ladira, meaning the chachamim say that it has a din of a carmelis, meaning you can't carry in it. That's only midarabana. Midaraisa, if it has a gate around it, it's a rishus hayachid, and you can carry in it completely. It's only the Rabban who came along and said that we're limiting the amount of fenced-in area, shlahuk of ladira, to base asayim, but more than that, we don't allow you to carry it. But since midaraisa, technically it still remains rishus hayachid, hazorik l'seichachayit. If you're standing in rishus harabim and you throw an object into a carpet, even if the carpet is more than base asayim, where the Rabban don't allow you to carry there, but since technically it's Rishus HaYachid, if you throw something from Rishus HaRabim into this area, you're chayiv because you moved an object from Rishus HaRabim to what is Deraisa Rishus HaYachid. My time, what the reason? Because of Mechitzahi. Technically there's a Mechitza which Midaraisa makes it into Rishus HaYachid, no matter how vast the space is. The only reason why the Rabbanon said you're not allowed to carry there is because people don't live there. So Midarabanan they can answer, but they can't create a kula. And therefore, since Midaraisa has a status of a Rishus HaYachid, if you threw from Rishus HaRabim into there, you're going to be chayav. Masiv Rav Huna bar Chidna. Rav Huna bar Chidna asked the following question. Sela Shabayam. You have a rock that comes out of the yam. Now we know the yam is considered a carmelis. And you had a rock that sticks out, it's a typical propeller killer. A rock that's close to the surface, that comes above the surface of the water. If it's above the surface, nishkafel police ski it. Sela Shabiyam. Gavoya Asara, it's 10 tvachim high. V'rachav arba. Now that means it's a Rishus HaYachid. We know anytime you have something that's Gavoya Asara v'rachav arba, no matter where it is, it's considered a Rishus HaYachid. Ein metalton loy mitoiche the yam, v'loy min yam mitoiche. Midarabanan, midaraisa, the yam is a Rishus HaYachid, it's a carmelis. But midarabanan, we say, since this area on the rock is even a Rishus HaYachid, midarabanan, and the yam around it is not a Rishus HaYachid, it's a carmelis, we don't allow you to carry from the top of the rock, this plateau, to the yam and back, because you're carrying from a Rishus HaYachid to a carmelis. Pachas mikan, if it's less than that, and we don't yet know what this means, the Gemara is going to analyze it shortly, metaltlin, you'd be able to carry. I'm sorry, I apologize. This is defined. Pachas mikan, if it's not 10 tefachim high, if this rock is not 10 tefachim high, now it just blends in to the rest of the yam because it doesn't become a distinct area. Metaltlin, you'd be able to carry from the rock to the ocean around it, because they're both halachically a carmelis. You're still limited to 4 amas because the Rabbanan give a carmelis the chumrah of a Rishus HaYachid and the chumrah of Rishus HaRabim, but nevertheless, you're definitely allowed to transfer something that's on top of this rock to the yam. So if you pull up alongside it, or you walk alongside it to the rock, you're allowed to take something off the rock and put something on the rock, because you're in a carmelis and that's a carmelis. Ad kama, and this is what's unclear. Up until what point is what we're saying true, and we don't yet know what this is talking about. Ad beis asayim. So the Gemara wants to know this last comment. Ad kama ad beis asayim ahaya. On what comment that we mentioned earlier is it referring to? Ilema aseifa, which means aseifa. If you have a sela shebayam that's low, it's not high, and the Brisa said that you're allowed to carry from the yam to this sela, and from the sela to this yam, because they're both carmelises. Frankly, more beis asayim tvei loy. What's the difference? If it's at this point we're saying the rock has the din of a carmelis. Once the rock has the din of a carmelis, what's the difference? How big that rock is? Once it's a carmelis, it's a carmelis. From the carmelis come atop. So it should be mutter to carry from this rock to the water, no matter how big the rock is, because no matter how big or small it is, it's still only considered a carmelus, which is identical to the area around it. Elalav Aresha.
But Yossi, isn't it only a carmelus if it's smaller than 10 by 4?
Could you say that again, please?
Isn't it only a carmelus? And the sefer of this brisa, it's only a carmelus because it's less than 10 by 4.
It's because it's less than 10 tefachim high. But no matter how wide it is, it doesn't matter anymore.
Ah.
Once it's less than 10 tefachim, it blends into its surrounding area.
Got it.
So Elalav, it must be going under Resha. So let's see what it would mean. Sela Shabiyam, so we're re-quoting the brisa and figuring out how it fits in. Sela Shabiyam, Gavoy Asar, if it's 10 tefachim high, the Rachav Dalad, and it's 4 wide. Ein Yitaltlin, we do not carry. Loy Mitoichel Layam, Loy Minayam Mitoichel. You're not allowed to carry either way because you're going from what's midaraisa. Because you're going from what's a Rishus Yochid to a Derabon Carmel. So midarabonon you wouldn't be allowed to carry back and forth. Yad Kama, until what point do you say you cannot carry? Ad base asayim. That's only if the rock is not a base asayim. Hayesim a base asayim. If the rock, even though 10 tefachim was bigger than the base asayim, metaltalin you'd be allowed to carry there because if it's bigger than the base asayim, then it's now considered a carmelus. Alma carmelusi. You see that it has the status of a carmelus. So Zoklamar Tiyuf to Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said that it always retains its status of Rosh Hashanah. Rabbi Yochanan said if you throw from Rosh Hashanah onto this rock, if it was bigger than the carmelus, if it was bigger than 2,000, he holds you to be chayiv, which means it retains its distinction as Rosh Hashanah. If that's the case, why would you be allowed to pass something from the yam to the rock if it's Yoshua Beis Hassan? That's the Gemara's kasha. Before we go weiter, being that we're getting very close to our deadline, I plan to start coming back to shul. So Mitchum, next week, starting Sunday morning, I'll be in shul. What time? We'll learn probably at 7 o'clock or 6:30. No. We used to learn at 6:30. Is there a 7:30 meeting on Sunday?
It's not yet. They're working on it.
Okay, so what time is davening on Sunday? 8?
8.
Okay, so we'll learn at 7 o'clock, the Mitchum Sunday morning in shul. And tomorrow, which is Shabbos afternoon, we could learn an hour before Mincha.
So Mincha is going to be a little earlier. Give me 1 sec. I'll tell you what Mincha is going to be.
Or we could follow up later this afternoon.
Shabbos. Mincha Shabbos is 6.
So we could learn at 5 o'clock.
Yeah. We
could learn at 5 o'clock Mincha Shabbos. And Motzei Shabbos, I am happy to repeat whatever we learned on Shabbos. We'll chazur that Motzei Shabbos on Zoom online. And if I'm not mistaken, Motzei Shabbos now is hovering around 8 o'clock. So we could learn. So Motzei Shabbos we'll learn on Zoom at 8:45, and I'll just repeat what we learned in shul on Shabbos afternoon at 5 o'clock. Okay, so let's get back to
Does anybody know when David Zolti is coming back?
David Zolti doesn't even know. As long as my outdoor minion is there, they're actually depending on me. So, and I'm in a very comfortable place. So, as long as it lasts, I'm gonna stay there.
I guess you didn't hear the rope.
No, what did he say?
Okay, I never.
Dovey, why would you throw a wrench into anyone's
I'm
plan?
sorry. Okay.
Nothing.
Yeah, enjoy it.
No, what did he say?
He just made a few comments about, people, they should be running back to shul. Anyways.
He said it in a town hall meeting setting.
All right, I never heard that.
Okay, sorry.
So it's Gemara. So let's think about this a little bit. Rabbi Yochanan said that if you have an area that's midrabanan a carmelus, but midaraisa it's a Rosh Hashanah, if you throw from Rosh Hashanah into that area, you'll be chayiv midaraisa because you're throwing an object from what is midaraisa Rosh Hashanah to what is midaraisa Rosh Hashanah. Just because the Rabbanan made it into a carmelus l'chumra, that wouldn't allow you to throw something from a Rosh Hashanah into that area. The Gemara is challenging Rabbi Yochanan from a case where the rock is considered a carmelus because it's Yosy Beis Hasayim, and it's in the Yam, which around it is a carmelus. And the Gemara says over here from a diak of the Brisa that if you have this rock that's Yosy Beis Hasayim and it's in the carmelus, you'd be allowed to throw from there to a carmelus. So the Gemara is asking from the fact that the Brisa seems to say that you're allowed to throw from carmelus A, meaning the top of the rock, to carmelus B, which is the ocean around it, that should disprove Rabbi Yochanan, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, that still maintains its distinction as a Rosh Hashanah, the Rabbanon should have also assered throwing from the rock, which is a carmelus, to the Yam, which is a carmelus, since technically the rock is considered a Rosh Hashanah midaraisa. So it's not exactly the same case. We're bringing a raya from a Rabbanon to a Rabbanon to the case of Rabbi Yochanan, where we're talking about throwing it from Rosh Hashanah, which is the Raisa. But that's the Gemara's kasha. So Amar Rava, you know who would ask such a kasha? Man de la yada terutza masnaisa, to yufta moisikla, Rabbi Yochanan. Only somebody who doesn't really understand how to learn Mishnais, only a person like that would ask a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan from this brisa. But if you really know how to learn a brisa, you would see it's not a challenge to the brisa at all. Zok Gemara, la olam hareisha. Really, the comment where the Mishnah says va'ad kamo ad beis hasayim, that's going on the reisha. This is how you read a reisha. It says that. Let's look back to the brisa so we have it clear inside. The brisa says as follows. The brisa says, "Sela shebayam." If you have a sela shebayam, gvoya sov v'reichav abal, so it's midaraisa rishus hayachid. Ein metalton loy min toichel hayam v'loy min hayam l'soichei. You're not allowed to carry from the yam, which is a carmelus, into this rishus hayachid, nor can you carry from the rishus hayachid of the rock back into the yam. Pachas mikan. If the rock is not 10 tefachim high, metalton, because it's a carmelus that blends into the carmelus around it. Zok to Gemara, the ad kama, up until what point? Ad beis sasayim. Up until what point do we say, Zok Rashi, up until what point do we say that it's going to be usher to carry from the rock to the water? That's only if the rock is smaller and it's considered Rosh Hashanah. But if the rock was big, it was the size of a beis hasayim, then in fact you would be allowed to carry from the surface of the rock to the water because they're both considered carmelus. Now it's already 6:50, so we have to stop, I believe. So we'll pick up this kasha and teretz and Rich some tomorrow.
Shkoyach.
Yeah.
Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.